Welcome back to Theories of Knowledge, the first online collaborative course for arts and humanities doctoral students across Scotland, organized by the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities with the support of the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Scottish Funding Council. Theories of Knowledge examines the ways in which philosophers and critical theorists have influenced and indeed continue to animate how we understand knowledge production within the arts and humanities fields. Gavin Miller will speak to us tonight, unpacking some of the knowledge claims implicit in psychoanalytic theory, focusing specifically on the ways in which psychoanalytic ideas translated from clinic to text and amongst disparate national and ideological contexts. Dr. Miller is Senior Lecturer in English Literature and Medical Humanities in the School of Critical Studies at the University of Glasgow, where he directs the Medical Humanities Research Centre. His research interests primarily engage the medical humanities, those areas of the humanities that complement, contextualize, and critique biomedical accounts of human nature, health, and well-being. He also writes about literary theory, particularly psychoanalytic theory, contemporary fiction, particularly science fiction, and Scottish literature. He is currently completing a monograph, Science Fiction and Psychology, with Liverpool University Press, and a Wellcome Trust-funded research project, Science Fiction and the Medical Humanities. If you're attending remotely tonight, please go ahead and log in to knowtheory.org, knowtheory.org, and navigate to the Ego and Id post on the discussion page to join the conversation. We look forward to your questions and comments. So, Dr. Miller?
Well, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, very flattered to have the invitation. I'm looking forward to delivering this lecture in a format that I've never used before. I've never done this kind of thing, and so it'll be something of an adventure for me as well. Now, let me just begin by elaborating on the aim of the lecture today and the structure of my presentation, what's on the menu, as it were. What I don't want to do, I'll try to avoid this, is to explicate in any great detail any particular lineage of psychoanalytic ideas. There are a great many books out there that will attempt to do this for you and will be particularly helpful with the more recondite theoretical strands of psychoanalysis. And when I was thinking about my lecture today, I thought, what would be the nightmare student asking a question afterwards? And it would be somebody who pulled out their battered copy of Anti-Oedipus, probably in the original French, and pointed to page 168 and said, "What does this mean?" And I would say, "I haven't a clue." I'm sorry, but perhaps somebody else can help you. So I've got a slightly different aim. I think what I want to do is to encourage different habits of thought in the use of psychoanalytic cultural theories, as you do in the arts and humanities, a different, perhaps higher order kind of reflection on what you're up to when you're using this kind of material. And there's a particular concern that is apparent in this lecture that comes, I think, from teaching and from supervision and from seeing psychoanalytic cultural theory used in the arts and humanities, and particularly at postgraduate level, where budding researchers are sort of spreading their wings and they feel, well, I must make a definite informed statement here. And what I detect is a little bit of a lack of what you might call independence or the ability to evaluate psychoanalytic cultural theory. I think some of it can be so recondite and so difficult to make sense of that the object of its use becomes the interpretation of it. What on earth does that mean? Having done that, I'll then use it. My heart always sinks slightly when I hear that phrase, "I'm going to use whoever it is on this text." I think, well, you might want to think about evaluating them as well. I applaud you for making sense of them, but you may wish to think about those knowledge claims, to criticise them, to contextualise them, to at least debate them in some way. And indeed, a few years ago, I ran a master's specialist option called Psychoanalytic Debates, because I was a bit fed up with this kind of mimicry of a particular rhetoric, a particular style, and particular discourses. So each week in that course, the reading would involve, well, confrontation is maybe too antagonistic a term, but some kind of encounter between broadly antithetical theoretical positions within psychoanalytic theory. And the idea was just to encourage reflection by not offering, as it were, an authoritative reference point that you just had to accept on trust. So in the very first session, which introduced Freud, the antithetical thinker was Ernest Gellner, who was entirely dismissive of psychoanalytic theory and practice in total, basically. And that was the starting point. Should you accept any of this at all? Psychoanalysis hasn't been particularly effective as a therapy. Does that then have ramifications for its other uses? And it's the spirit of that course, I think, which informs my lecture today. I want to encourage better habits of thought, you might say, in the use of psychoanalytic cultural theory. And part of that will be an invitation to evaluate psychoanalytic critical theories, not just to use them, to interpret them, but to evaluate them, think about what that might mean, what's reasonable for you to do to evaluate psychoanalytic theories as you're using them, and also to gesture towards some of the contingencies and the accidents and the adventitious factors in the way that psychoanalytic ideas are transmitted and the ways in which they spread and the ways in which they are transformed and retained. And I'll focus more, I think, on the national and territorial aspects of that as one kind of contingency. So that's the aim of the lecture. The lecture itself divides essentially into three sections. Everything divides into three sections because it's easy to remember. Firstly, I'll give a brief reminder of the origins of psychoanalysis in Freud. For many of you, of course, this will be teaching my grandmother to suck eggs, but there will be others who are not particularly familiar with psychoanalysis or want a reminder. And anyway, it will be a kind of shared starting point. So I'll talk about its origins in a particular clinical practice. Then in the second section, I'll move on to what you might call a critical incident in my own intellectual development, such as it is. A concern that arose as I was reading around and thinking about Jacques Lacan's famous essay on the mirror stage. And actually, some of the material came out of that psychoanalytic debates course that I'll introduce here. There was a definite... I came out of that encounter with a definite sense that one had to work against a particular rhetoric and a particular folk history of psychoanalytic cultural theory, and using Lacan's mirror stage essay can demonstrate this pretty well, I think. It's a very useful kind of focus for the argument I want to make. And in the third concluding section, I'll just show some of the contingencies in the translation and transplantation of psychoanalytic ideas. And what I'm wanting to do there is just to unsettle this assumption of a single lineage of thinkers, of master thinkers in dialogue, and include female master thinkers here, incidentally. A single lineage of debate and dialogue between these master thinkers. It begins with Freud, and then it goes through Lacan, who is the next master thinker, and then you can go to Deleuze and Guattari, or maybe you can have Rigouret and Christie's, if you want another direction. I very much want to challenge that assumption of a single kind of dialectic development, and think instead about contingencies and adventitious factors. So anyway, let's start with the basics. Man with a cigar. Psychoanalysis. Who, when, where, what, how? Well, an enormous 20th century cultural movement, I suppose. It continues today, so it's also 21st century. It was begun by Sigmund or Sigismund Freud, a Viennese Jew, a medical doctor, official bona fide physician, who pioneered what was called for a while the talking cure, a talking cure, with his colleague Josef Brauer. And together they were working clinically with neurotic patients, patients with what you might call minor mental illnesses, not the psychoses. And from that initial clinical context, they developed a theory of psychoanalysis, with, of course, Freud being the one who really ran with it into public prominence. A landmark text in terms of cultural ramifications of psychoanalysis, well, of course, I think the interpretation of dreams is really the one you would single out there. It presents a theory of the unconscious mind. It gives an account of the interpretation of dream symbolism and, of course, other cultural materials as well. It's perhaps also an avenue by which Freud's ideas entered into the wider public consciousness, not just the medical one, but a wider kind of cultural authority could accrue around Freudian ideas. Now, Freud was a prolific author. You will probably have noticed this. The standard edition of the complete Freud, I checked on Amazon, runs to 24 volumes and would cost you £300. And it covers just so many topics. It seems a very all-purpose theory. Hysteria, minor mental illness, dreams, jokes, sexual identity, aggression, religion, art and literature. And psychoanalysis, even just within the parameters of Freud's work, spawns an increasingly ambitious research program. What begins with just a few neurotic patients in the late 1880s is, by the 1930s, something that we'll happily talk about the origins of civilization and supposed anthropological rights, all the way up to the fate of Western civilization and the death drive and all the rest of it and why we had the Great War, etc. No lack of ambition, but you might also call it mission creep. Freud founded psychoanalysis, but psychoanalysis, at least in the clinical setting amongst therapists, is famed for its many ramifications, its many schisms. It's endlessly schismatic. Schools founded by Jung, by Adler, by Lacan, by Klein, by Winnicott, by Edinburgh's own W.R.D. Fairbairn. It's a very schismatic movement, famously divisive. You have to be careful of the politics of it all. Freud and these other psychoanalytic schools permeated 20th century culture. We know that much, that's obvious. It's there in our vocabulary, everyday terms. Freudian slip, Oedipal complex, phallic symbol, unconscious or repressed desires, collective unconscious archetypes, inferiority complex, all ideas from psychoanalytic thinkers, and even more general psychological terms that are used in everyday life, like introvert and extrovert. Well, they were Jungian terms, not perhaps intimately tied to his psychoanalytic theory, but nonetheless pioneered by him. So it's had a tremendous cultural impact. It's the water we swim in a sense, and perhaps we're not quite aware of it. But while psychoanalysis, I think, is still prominent in cultural theory, still has this legacy in our vocabulary and in our life world, it has, I think, declined greatly as a popular psychology for various reasons, including its increasing lack of purchase on clinical life and contexts. And in many ways, something like probably evolutionary psychology has stepped in, or pop evolutionary psychology has stepped in and displaced psychoanalysis as, a useful popular psychology that does things like say what we really mean and want and do, and that makes sense of life for us in sort of grand, historical, even cosmological contexts. EP, evolutionary psychology, is now, the Daily Mail go-to psychology of choice. It's not a recommendation. So let's have some basic psychoanalytic ideas. Let's assume that we all know that psychoanalysis, in its various forms, in some way unmasks our conscious life to reveal the activity of an unconscious mind of some sort. Details vary. Who knows? There are lots of different kinds of unconscious out there, and we'll see some of the variation. Now, this hypothesis of an unconscious mind wasn't really particularly original. The idea of the unconscious was pretty familiar in late 19th century Europe. Henri Ellenberger wrote a large book about it, the construction of the unconscious mind in European culture. It was there famously in Nietzsche, the notion of a will to power that was unconscious, a hidden motive that was expressed in thought and action, and could unmask sort of our sacred cows and supposedly ideal behaviours. Schopenhauer also, before Nietzsche, spoke of a will, the will of biological life, the will of the species as a whole working through us as individuals to make us do all kinds of very unwise things for us as individuals, like reproduce, but very good for the species. But Freud certainly gave this idea of the unconscious mind a very powerful, influential, medical, scientific expression. He gave medical scientific authority and thus cultural authority, because we respect medics and scientists, to the idea of the unconscious. Freud really gave that weight to it. This was a doctor speaking, by God, a scientist. And the rhetoric that surrounded Freud's discovery, if you call it that, of the unconscious mind was, well, this man is the equivalent, equal to Galileo, to Darwin, to Newton. He's given us a complete scientific revolution. And this was the rhetoric of peak Freudianism in the mid-20th century. I was watching a few months ago John Huston's biopic, Freud, from 1962, starring Montgomery Clift, a biopic of the Freudian story, kind of noirish, black and white biopic, originally scripted by Sartre, who offered a screenplay that would have run to about 7 hours, so it was drastically cut down. And that's precisely its rhetoric in the opening and closing. This is the great Newton, Galileo, Darwin. This is the equivalent of heliocentrism for our age, the discovery of the unconscious mind. And what did Freud say about the unconscious at least one point in his... There's so many mutations here, but one thing he said about the unconscious in his early work, well, he divided the mind essentially into 3 parts. In his early work, there's a tripartite division. You get later accretions like the superego and all the rest of it, later stuff. But in the early work, the mind is essentially tripartite. There's 3 parts. The conscious mind, what you're all having now, you're all conscious, I assume, or sleeping with your eyes open. The pre-conscious mind is not part of your conscious experience now, but it's voluntarily accessible. I can remember what I had for breakfast this morning. It was muesli with banana, and I had a cup of coffee. That's the pre-conscious mind. And then the unconscious proper. It's not part of the conscious mind, not part of conscious existence. Moreover, it's not voluntarily accessible. You cannot simply choose to look into it, but it is there. And it contains, if we can use a spatial metaphor, it contains things such as irrational ideas, wishes, forbidden urges, emotional trauma. And as Ernest Gilner pointed out, one of the exciting things about the unconscious mind is it's the wild party side of you that you don't let out into daylight. It'd be very boring if the unconscious mind was just your everyday waking mind, but unconscious. If you thought about, it was thinking about IKEA and B&Q and all the rest of it, it's just unconsciously. No, it's much more exciting than that. It's carnivalesque, it's inverted, it's glorious, frightening, exciting, racy. Now, the unconscious mind, at least in Freudian psychoanalysis, is not innate. You're not born with an unconscious mind. The unconscious mind is created through repression, or perhaps more strictly, dissociation. The mind, again we're using spatial, perhaps even biological metaphors, the mind has split at some point. It's insisted around a certain conflict. The mind splits because of an operation of repression or dissociation, in which something unbearable in consciousness is actively expelled from it, pushed out of consciousness, but remains in some way in mental life, in some curious, paradoxical, unconscious mentation. Now, in the early Freud, the early Freud had a fairly Catholic view of what might be repressed. It just had to be basically unbearable. It could be it's a traumatic assault of some kind, maybe a sexual one. It could be much more mundane. It could be feelings of resentment towards a loved one. You're caring for a dying relative and you hate them. Push those feelings out because they're unbearable, inadmissible. In the mature Freud, repression becomes much more kind of monistic. The founding repression, the founding dissociation, it surrounds the unacceptable, forbidden sexual desires of an incestuous nature that plague little boys and girls, or so we're told. And that's the foundational repression or dissociation. Freud becomes increasingly systematic, increasingly monistic as he proceeds, until he invents the death trap and becomes a dualist. Well, if only the unconscious would just remain there and do nothing, you wouldn't have to worry about it. You wouldn't even know it existed. You could hypothesize about it. Perhaps there is an unconscious mind, but it leaves no evidence. The repressed, however, returns. There's our cliche. The dissociated, this realm of unconscious mentation of thoughts and feelings and memories that are not conscious still affects conscious life. It intrudes into our life as something alien to us in some way, something of the nature of a compulsion that besets us, some kind of alien intruder upon our life. So the repressed returns as bodily symptoms, somatic conversions, hysterical paralysis, hysterical blindness, strange compulsive desires or attractions, fetishes, compulsive fears that seem irrational, phobias, neurotic anxieties that really seem exaggerated for the sort of realistic way, automatisms, automatic behaviour, tics and all the rest. That's the stuff of clinical interest, but the repressed returns a subclinical, non-pathological level. There is the unconscious in everyday life, and Freud wrote about that at great length as well, of course. And the unconscious as manifest in dreams and jokes, in various forms of symbolism in our cultural life. And maybe that's a useful point to remember and to think about in terms of this terminology, introducing the lecture of ego and id. These are terms introduced into Anglophone culture by interwar translators of Freud. In the original German, ego and id are simply ich and es, I and it. The conscious is the ego, in the early Freud, is I. The unconscious, the id, is it. And that's perhaps a more helpful way of thinking about the id as raging repressed desires. Id is it. The compulsive, the automatic, the alien, the ego alien that intrudes upon our lives that doesn't make sense. But those Latinate terms are interesting in their own way. The psychoanalytic historian and psychiatrist, I believe, George McCarry, has argued that part of the function of those Latinate terms in Anglophone culture was just to add medical scientific authority to Freud's ideas. They're a bit like anatomical jargon. Here are the proper grown-up doctor's words. They added that authority, but of course in that translation they took Freudian theory further away from internal experience. There's something slightly alienating about this vocabulary, something slightly reifying as well. Maybe in the original German it's a much more immediately meaningful piece of terminology. It's worth noting as well this point about ego and id in translations, because it's a very straightforward example of how psychoanalytic ideas are transformed in circulation and translation by often quite haphazard factors. That translation decision made a difference to the reception of Freud in Anglophone culture. Anyway, we have this unconscious mind, manifest as the it that besets me, the meaningless yet compulsive. What phenomena are there? What is of interest to a Freudian, broadly conceived, both clinical and cultural? So the unconscious returns in various ways. And we can infer its existence. It sneaks past the mechanisms of dissociation, sneaks past our resistance to acknowledging what's in it. In the original clinical work of Freud and Brouwer, it was very much a matter of bodily symptoms. These were prime evidence for the unconscious mind. Hysterical conversion symptoms. The conversion of some kind of mental material into a somatic expression that was meaningful in some way. So, for instance, a patient suffers from blurred vision without any particular somatic etiology there, no bodily physiological cause. Freud and Brouwer perform their, one or other, or both of them performs their procedure of talking to you. And this somatic symptom turns out to be the bodily expression of a repressed, dissociated memory. The patient at some point in her life suffered a traumatic experience in which her eyes filled with tears, blurring her vision. This trauma was repressed out of consciousness, but the memory returns and is effective as this alien hysterical symptom. It appears to be simply meaningless and simply bodily in origin, but it's not. It is, in fact, part of mental life, of unconscious mental life. Well, that was the original kind of somatic nucleus. But of course, Freudian ideas developed and they gathered up yet more phenomena into their reach. Another very useful kind of evidence for Freudians is parapraxis or parapraxis, accidentally purposive action. Stuff that seems to be happening by chance or accident, but is perhaps gratifying to you in some way that you won't admit. In the old days, when people had diaries, you could use your diary in order to forget an inconvenient appointment. Oh, I've lost my diary. How inconvenient. I left it on the train. I don't have to meet you. I don't really very much like you. Now you have to lose your phone, and that's too expensive. But slips of tongue, we still have slips of tongue. Anneliesen says, I abhor my wife. And Sarah says, abhor? What? Adore? Oops. Oh, this slip of the tongue, that was a parapraxis. I said abhor, not adore. Oh dear. More Freudian phenomena. Increasingly ambitious research program. Dream symbolism. We all love dream symbolism. The dream is the unconscious in one of its most naked forms, but it's still not very naked. It sneaks past the sensory operations that block it and produces symbols that nonetheless we can interpret and make sense of, though they may appear to be meaningless or odd or baffling. So, for instance, in a Freudian study, a young woman in what's euphemistically termed an unsatisfactory marriage, and that's not to do with disputes about the washing up. A young woman in an unsatisfactory marriage dreams of trying to put a broken candle into a candle holder. Freud works out that this dream is about her repressed frustration at her husband's sexual impotence, and also Freud thinks it's probably also about a temptation to masturbate. Symbolism is very clear sexual imagery there. And Freud postulated two primary mechanisms for coding the dream, condensation and displacement, which are rather different in their Freudian original form than perhaps later theorists have indicated. Dreams disguise by condensing complex thoughts, really quite complex propositions, into a single image. The broken candle actually stands for a series of thoughts there. Moreover, they displace tricky emotions onto that coded form rather than the real concern. So the woman in her dream is dreaming of intense frustration and annoyance at the candle and the candle holder. So the emotional, the affective part is sneaking into her life, but the object is other than her husband. That's displacement. The affect is displaced onto this apparently meaningless, innocuous object. Of course, it's just a dream, so it's all nonsense anyway. I think it would be easy to impose a rather mechanistic schema upon Freudian interpretation of dream symbolism. I think when you actually look at what he does, the ways that he decodes the so-called work of the dream or dream work, there's lots of different hermeneutic strategies that he uses. Sometimes it's similarities, sometimes it's associations, sometimes it's puns, sometimes it's the opposite of the thing that he invokes in order to decode. I don't think there's such an easy schematic pattern as one might think. It's rather complex and very literary kind of operation. Now, if you go and see your psychoanalyst, having read Interpretation of Dreams, and thought, well, this is for me, the psychoanalyst will also induce potentially meaningful communications from the unconscious by inviting you to free associate. Please do not censor yourself. Say the first thing that comes into your mind. Lie on the couch. I will be behind you, safe out of eyeshot, as you say the first thing that comes into your mind. Oh, tell me about your mother. And this is a way of trying to coax the unconscious out from its little mouse hole. What's the first thing that comes into your mind? Word associations. What does that mean? Don't censor yourself. And so on and so on. Now we're going to an even wider remit out of the clinical context. Well, of course, Freud was wont to interpret cultural materials. God is a cultural material. I've been struck down yet. So, for the purposes of argument, God is a cultural material. And in the patriarchal Abrahamic religion, said Freud, that God that you worship is the compulsive outward projection of repressed feelings of unconscious childhood dependency when you were dependent upon the all-powerful father who ruled the roost in your household. and that's what he is. Freud also liked to interpret literature. He should have been discouraged, but he was also keen in making sense of literature in his own way, famed for his interpretation of Hamlet. Hamlet cannot kill Claudius because Hamlet identifies with his murderous uncle because his murderous uncle is acting out Hamlet's own Oedipal fantasies of having sex with his mother. There's a Freud interpretation of sorts, not to be imitated. All these phenomena, symptoms, parapraxis, dream symbolism, free association in clinical context, cultural materials of a more or less sedimented, standardized form sometimes, these are all supposed evidence, putative evidence, for the existence of the unconscious mind and, moreover, what's going on in it. It's scandalous, shocking content that has to be censored. And Freudian theory, one way of looking at it, is as something that restores meaning to apparently meaningless materials. They become much more like the conscious material of conscious life, where there are meaningful connections in your psychic life. That was not an accident, that was an action. That was more than just a dream, it was telling something. And in one account of psychoanalytic theory, you might get from somebody like Habermas, psychoanalytic interpretation restores interrupted self-communication. It's a communicative model of it. So there's quite a lot of hard work there. You might think, well, why can't I know the it? Given all this massed evidence for the unconscious mind, which for Freud is supposedly transculturally constant. There's also an unconscious mind and it's always broadly Oedipal. Why is knowing the unconscious such hard work? And the answer, of course, is resistance, some kind of will not to know the mechanisms of repression and dissociation. For Freud, this will to ignorance was based essentially on fear. Fear in that Oedipal triangle, the traumatic repression of infantile sexuality because of fear of punishment, specifically of castration, for the boy at least. But there are additional accounts of resistance and there are accretions to the model. And one of these I'm going to turn to now, and it's one that's very well known. It's Lacan's account of the mirror stage and the supposed ego ideal of transparency and mastery that supposedly arises from the mirror stage. I'm doing it not so much to explicate Lacan, though I will, I hope, I aim to, I aspire to, but it's also to illustrate a particular style of thinking within psychoanalytic cultural theory that I think can be problematic. So yeah, I've called this a critical incident, because this was very much a culmination of a series of frustrations and annoyances at psychoanalytic cultural theory. And why did it just have to be so recondite? And why didn't we want to talk about problems in it or contemporary developments? And I think working on this essay in the context of seminar classes with top postgraduates really helped solidify my arguments and my thoughts about it, and my sense of growing dissatisfaction with my own habits of thought. Now, many of you are very probably familiar with Jacques Lacan's famous essay, The Mirror Stage, published in French in 1966, and based on earlier, I believe, conference presentations or seminar presentations from 1936 and 1949. And I've chosen it because it is so familiar, it's so widely anthologized, it's a staple of the undergraduate curriculum, and it has, it's something into which other ideas are slotted as well. It's something of a reference point. The essay outlines a formative encounter that supposedly takes place in the infant's mental life between the age of 6 to 18 months. The infant encounters its own reflection in a mirror, and essentially, crudely speaking, it falls in love with itself, or it falls in love with that image. To unpack it a bit, the infant perceives a visual whole, a gestalt, that contrasts with its own internal experience. That image is whole, somewhat coordinated. The infant can move its hand, and the image will move as well. And that image of wholeness and bodily integrity stands out against the background. It's a gestalt. It's a structured whole against the background. The infant, on the other hand, experiences itself as fragmented. Its body doesn't work together particularly well. It's uncoordinated. And according to the hypothesis of primary narcissism, it has a somewhat erratic sense of where it stops. It's not quite where it stops and where, say, its mother begins or the environment begins. rather erratic sense of its own boundaries, but they're neatly defined in the mirror image. It falls in love with that. The mirror image captivates the child. And it provides, says Lacan, the basic form of an ideal I or ego ideal. It gives the infant an aspiration for what's represented by this image. An aspiration towards self-mastery, autonomy, integrity, an aspiration that can never really be fulfilled. It sets it in this fictional direction. Shades of Adler there for the experts. And this alienating identity, that's what Lacan calls it, this alienating identity is an extra source, an extra wrinkle in the source of resistance to the insights of psychoanalytic theory into the unconscious mind. We're so invested in this specular image, that's another reason that we can't readily accept the unconscious mind. For the unconscious, after all, defies conscious control, mastery, and transparency. Okay, that's a very crude outline of the mirror stage. The essay is very widely anthologized. You're not an anthology, this anthology, the next anthology. It's frequently cited within cultural theory. It's the basis of many subsequent extrapolations. One example, Laura Mulvey's 1975 article in an Anglophone context, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. Well, that article uses Lacan's thinking to theorize what Mulvey views as the masculinist pleasures of Hollywood cinema. She says this: a male movie star's glamorous characteristics are those of the more perfect, more complete, more powerful ideal ego conceived in the original moment of recognition in front of the mirror. So essentially one half of the male cinema-goer's pleasure is, according to Mulvey, a consequence of the mirror stage identification. The male viewer is taking a fetishistic delight in looking at women on screen. It's another part of it. He's also identifying with the mirror image selfhood of the male agent in cinematic narrative. Think of a Bond movie. Here's a pretty girlfriend to look at, and you can identify with Bond going around shooting people, having sex with them. Separately. But despite the influence of this essay, I'm rather uncomfortable with the celebration of it. There are lots of problems with it. I think we're in an interesting position where we're presenting an essay to you that if you imitated its merits, such as they are, you would probably fail. If you wrote an essay in the style of the mirror stage, you might scrape by with a D. I don't think you would do very well. We expect better of you than this essay. That's the critical instance. What are the problems then with the mirror stage as an article? Let's assess it by the protocols that might be used upon your work as postgraduate students or past, present, or future. Raymond Pallas has explored at length the sort of psychological credibility of Lacan's arguments. He does it very well. I'm just going to pick out a few of them here. He's got some nice arguments, and they're all very apposite. And one big problem is just the empirical plausibility of the mirror encounter. There are responses to this, and I'll come to them, but just to outline Pallas's critique. Pallas says, well, can we really accept the supposed contrast between the allegedly uncoordinated infant and the wholeness of the image perceived in the mirror? Because as Pallas points out, the actual experience of reflections for an infant is probably very different. An infant is more likely to see bits of itself, only from one side, and these experiences are likely to be fleeting and disjointed. So where is that continuity and wholeness in the actual experience of its own mirror image? And moreover, if the image is perceived as a whole in some way, somehow assembled into a whole, then that seems to imply that the infant is bringing the concept of a stable self to the visual experience of its mirror image, not that it's acquiring it from it narcissistically. Pallas also asks many questions, but he asks another, and I like it because it's naive. It's a great naive question. He says, what are the implications of this theory for a society without mirrors? Or what are the implications of this theory for congenitally blind individuals? Because if this theory is correct, and selfhood in the model that we know it is kicked off by a narcissistic encounter with a visual image of yourself, congenitally blind individuals shouldn't have this ego ideal. Let's go and find some and see if they use words like I. Let's see if they have an ego ideal like ours. They seem to, except they're blind. I like it because it's naive. It's exactly the kind of question that you're invited not to ask. And he does say, well, what are their no mirrors? What are they blind? Good question. There are responses, but we'll discuss them in a bit. Another problem is more at the level of theoretical adequacy, explanatory adequacy. And Tallis asks, does this theory actually explain anything at all? It's a point I've made to some extent already. Lacan assumes that the child recognises itself in the mirror. And let's just imagine that encounter. Here's the mirror image in front of the child. Hold it up. Look at yourself. Lacan assumes that the child recognises itself in the mirror, and this is the basis of sense of self. But how can the child recognise that image as being of its own body and of itself, unless it has a sense of self in the first place? Isn't this entirely unneeded as an explanation? Doesn't this theory assume the very sense of selfhood that it's supposed to explain? Isn't it just smuggled in there as something already assumed? I mean, it would seem to imply that there's something innate. If you're going to say this actually happens, then there would have to be something present in the infant already, maybe something innate, some prior sense of unified self, so it can seize upon that mirror image and say, well, that is me. How can it fall in love with an image of itself without having a self, or sense of self in the first place? Now, Tallis' critique is empirical and it's conceptual. Does it make sense in terms of empirical plausibility? Does this really have an explanatory role as a theory in that sense? There's another avenue of critique, and one that comes from Michael Billich in 2006 article, and that's to do with the rhetoric of the essay. And almost in a very mechanical way, the level of citing and explicating secondary sources, which is something you're all required to do, I assume, at some point in your life. And Billich notes in his article on the mirror stage, he notes what we might diplomatically call unacknowledged dependency in the essay. Unacknowledged dependency upon the work of Henri Wallon, a major figure in French interwar psychology. And Billy says, well, Wallon, who's not cited in the mirror stage, says many of the things that Lacan does before explicitly. Wallon, says Billy, emphasises the importance of the child's self-recognition in the mirror for the development of a sense of self. And also, as he points out, Wallon argues that the mirror image provides the only complete image of the child's body, where previously it's only seen its body in fragments. Now, Wallon's work is not cited anywhere in the mirror stage as an essay, and Wallon indeed only appears fleetingly in Lacan's body of writing. But the dependencies are so obvious that other scholars, such as Elizabeth Runesco, have basically said, well, Lacan plagiarised. Well, he's a plagiarist. I advise you, as students, not to plagiarize. Billich also notes flagrant misrepresentation of the sources that are cited. So in the first few paragraphs of the mirror stage, Lacan refers to comparative studies with chimpanzees, studies conducted by the Gestalt psychologist Wolfgang Köhler. And Lacan refers to these studies and implies that the gist of them is that the infant's self-recognition in the mirror is something unique to humans. This is something only humans do. In fact, as Billich points out, Köhler said just the opposite. He in fact observed chimpanzees seeming to contemplate their own mirror image, despite it having no practical or utilitarian significance. So Lacan just simply misrepresented what Wallon says. And indeed, if you're citing secondary sources, you should represent them with some degree of fidelity or accuracy. So to sum up, if you submit essays or chapters or whatever it is that are conceptually incoherent, or at least lack explanatory power, which are empirically improbable or unsubstantiated, depending upon the kind of evidence you work with, or which plagiarise sources or misrepresent them, you're going to do very badly indeed, unless you're very cunning at it and we don't notice. So what kind of responses then can we make, hypothetically at least, to what Lacan does in that essay, and the celebration of this essay, the mirror stage? How can we deal with this kind of problem, a problem posed by Lacan's essay, the mirror stage, a famous essay, a reference point? Is there anything we can do that will allow us to continue to use it as a reference point in some way? Can we defend its continued celebration? There it is, endlessly anthologized. The stuff of first, second, third year lecturers, at least in my discipline in English literature. It's canonical. But we don't often hear that critique. Is there some kind of defence? I'm going to sketch out a few possible defences. I think some of them work better than others. I don't think, in part or in whole, they're compelling, but they are worth considering. One defence of this kind of knowledge claim in Lacan's essay on the mirror stage is to say, well, we should continue to read Lacan because of his historical significance. That's why we should value that essay. Whatever we think of that essay now in light of later scholarship and indeed later studies on infants, it was undoubtedly a landmark essay in the importation of post-structuralist ideas from France into an Anglophone context. It's immensely significant historically, and we are professionals and we should know the history and the development and evolution of the ideas that we use, including mistakes and errors, because they still had a historical impact upon our discipline. And so perhaps there's an analogy here maybe with contemporary medics. We study the history of medicine and, we'll look into ideas like homeopathy. So you may say, well, it's fair enough. That's what we can do. We can say it's of historical interest. I think that's a valid point, but it's slightly inauthentic or insincere, because it's not as if you read your boys and girls bumper book of critical theory and you turn to the mirror stage and it's prefaced with a lengthy discussion of all its conceptual and empirical and rhetorical problems. I think it's broadly true that the typical presentation of the mirror stage in published discourse and pedagogy is of a landmark discovery that still speaks to us in the present. I think it's often probably still framed that way. Lacan discovered this. Aha! You have a self-ideal, there is an illusion of mastery and autonomy and trust, etc. It's a discovery. Another defence, perhaps more complex defence, is on grounds of heuristic fruitfulness. The mirror stage is good, not because it's convincing in itself, we're assuming from the moment it isn't, but because it's stimulated so many lines of inquiry, many of them perhaps plausible on their own grounds without assuming the validity of the mirror stage as an argument. So they're part of what you might call the context of discovery rather than the context of justification. Maybe Laura Mulvey needed the stimulus of this idea of the mirror stage from Lacan to write her intriguing account of visual pleasure in Hollywood narrative cinema and its masculinity. And maybe you could say, well, all those Lacanian elements in there in that account of the male cinema goer's identification with the agent actor, well, maybe that stuff is just a kind of scaffolding. It helped her construct her argument, but when her argument's built, you could actually just take it all down. You can remove it later implicitly as readers, and you're still left with a good argument. I think that's probably true of Mulvey's essay, that you wouldn't necessarily need Lacanian theory. It's there as a theoretical context. But you can see what she's talking about, even without assuming the validity of the mirror stage as a psychoanalytic tenet. It stands on its own. You can offer a related kind of argument as well, not strictly about heuristic fruitfulness, but maybe a more direct defence of Lacanian theory, whether clinical or cultural. Maybe you could say, well, this essay, what it did, despite its problems, despite its inadequacies, maybe it leveraged investment in a programme of research that would later pay off. Even if its foundational statements are tenuous, maybe there are currently more developed, more consistent, more complex accounts of Lacanian ideas. And there are some very, very good exegeses of Lacan out there. Bruce Fink, scholar at Duquesne University, gives a great account and, I suppose, defence of Lacanian psychoanalysis. Really talks about the clinical practice in a way that is very compelling and maybe his own version of Lacanian clinical practice, but it's very clear what's going on. I think this is a plausible defence, part of the way theories of knowledge develop and accumulate. It's not uncommon to find this in the human sciences. A foundational paper but it's on its own terms doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. We later find out it doesn't really stand up. This is apparent, for instance, with psychological schools such as behaviorism. Behaviorism, allegedly the much more hard-nosed, allegedly predictive psychological science, working with outer observable phenomena and relations of cause and effect. Foundational paper, John B. Watson's classic 1920 article on conditioned emotional reactions. A very famous paper, one that's spread out into popular culture, a classic textbook citation, but one that's been widely critiqued. Watson's paper, his behaviours paper, describes the conditioning of a fear reflex in an 11-month-old infant. And what he's doing is saying, in this paper, I'm showing you that I could effectively create a phobia. Aha, you don't need psychoanalysis, you need behaviourism. And what he does is he gets an infant, one particular infant, and he strikes a suspended iron bar with a hammer, and he finds that this reliably frightens the infant. It's a reliable fear reflex out of it. He then strikes the suspended iron bar with his hammer while presenting a white rat to the infant. Look at that, John. The fear reflex is then extended to the white rat. The white rat provokes fear even in absence of the original unconditioned stimulus. The fear reflex is conditioned upon the presence of the white rat. It's a phobia of the rat. And according to Watson, white furry things in general would provoke this conditioned response. Historians have looked into this and they say, well, really, when you look at what actually went on in the records and all the rest of it, the results were nowhere near as reliable as Watson pretended. This paper is something of an origin myth for a psychological school rather than a really convincing report. There are all kinds of problems with this supposed experimental protocol. Sometimes they would startle those infants by basically chucking the rat at it. Sometimes they would present the conditioned stimuli in abruptly startling ways. So they would wave something white and furry at it to startle it, and then say, there's a conditioned response. So the problem of an origin founding paper that doesn't really stand up isn't unique to psychoanalysis. So we could say, well, you and all, you as well, you've also got this problem, behaviourists. But look what happens afterwards. The research programme pays off. Or Christ. That's another defence. We could also argue with respect to the mirror stage, and this is something colleagues in textual disciplines love. Literary critics love this. We could say, well, maybe the problem is interpretative. Never mind all this stuff about empirical plausibility and conceptual coherence and all the rest of it. Maybe you just haven't really understood what that mirror stage essay article is saying. You haven't really properly grasped it, and you're repudiating something that it doesn't really say. And I think there's some kind of textual scholar who will say this, will sort of, clutch their hand back, aghast at the literalism of Talas's critique. What do you mean, real mirrors? Oh. There are responses. So Tallis says, right, what if there's no mirrors around or the infant is blind? Well, there are responses. Well, it's not a literal mirror. Don't you realise this mirror is presented literally for the benefit of the unwashed masses, but the mirror is not a literal mirror in an actual moment, but it's the mirroring responses of people in an infant's interpersonal context in a series of infants. That's the mirror. And you can go further. You could say, well, don't be so naive as to think that this infant is a real infant either. Like a real touchable, squidgy infant of that kind. No. It could be the clinical infant. Clinical infants, you don't see them in prams. The clinical infant is the picture of infancy that emerges in clinical psychoanalytic encounters where free association draws out this unconscious content. It's not anything to do with observable child 16, 18 months old. This is an account of a fantasy of childhood. It's an account of the clinical. And you can play this card increasingly boldly. Maybe the essay is in no way about psychogenesis at all. Maybe it's the retelling of a powerful or informative myth. And Lacan has just subtly added the authority of the human sciences. So think of this text as something like Camus' myth of Sisyphus. It's an illuminating philosophical narrative, and instead of using Greek myth, he's expressed it in mythological language of infant psychology. And there's another possible interpretive response. You just haven't understood it. It's a possible response. Worth noting that this brings rather a scriptural tinge to your activities as scholars. The Lacanian text is inerrant, so long as you recognise the naivety of literal interpretations. It's always right, and you're always wrong, and you have to find the figurative interpretation that will show what it's actually trying to say, which is, of course, correct. And then the middle stage, it's something like, Genesis or the resurrection. You need a hermeneutic that goes beyond the empirical implausibility of the account. Who moved the stone? Who cares? It wasn't a literal stone. So all of these, I think, would be conceivable responses. They are ways of preserving the authority and value of an essay like the mirror stage. I don't think, though, that separately or in combination that they're really absolutely compelling. I think it might be tactless, or it might annoy people, but it would be entirely proper to simply disregard the mirror stage, even within psychoanalytic cultural theory, and say we should do without it. I mean, that is what we should do. Or we should just say, time to stop recycling this thing. It's too many problems. We just think about those defences again and the habits of thought that are illuminated by them. This is what maybe we feel impelled or compelled to do. How dare we disregard the mirror stage? We've got to say that somehow, and by this conceptual wiliness, we will. What does that tell us about what we tend to do with this material, the way we approach this theory of knowledge? Well, it's useful to return again to Michael Billig's analysis of the mirror stage in that article, which I think is really very good and informative. He says this in his conclusion. The lack of bibliographic detail, the use of foreign technical terminology, and the omission of key sources comprise a pattern. Given Lacan's own references to the master-slave relationship of language, it is not difficult to say that Lacan places his readers in the subservient position of needing to accept the authoritative word of the master. And Billig continues, he rounds this out a bit. He says, at the centre of this phenomenon is the mythology of Lacan as a lone creative genius who has importantly rethought the ideas of that other lone genius, Freud. So this rhetorical style, which is subservient to these ex cathedra announcements from Lacan, is very much bound up in what you might call a folk history of psychoanalytic theory and its development. There is, I'm afraid, something of a popular history of psychoanalysis, even in academic contexts, which psychoanalytic theory is, as I've indicated earlier, this lineage of thought, which is only really essentially added to by master thinkers of both genders. And there's a cumulative, essential critical dialogue there. The only one that matters. It begins in Freud, goes through Lacan, seasoned with Saussure, of course, culminates in Kristeva and Irigaray, or maybe Deleuze and Guattari, or whoever's after that. And absent from it are the contributions of other theorists and schools. And even also, I won't develop this point particularly, but even also of patients themselves, of analysts. In that folk history, it's as if the people who actually come into these clinical contexts and provide all this material in no way help to co-construct psychoanalytic cultural theory. They're just there as sort of data that shows up. There's no sense in which they contribute or provoke or incite ideas. Although when you look more closely at psychoanalytic theorists, they often confess it was a patient. Really, when you think about this again, they said something. The patient said, "You're scared to love me," and I realised they were. It'd be very interesting to think about what actual analytic patients would say some of the theories that are passed around in their name. When Jameson turns to Lacan and says, well, I'm going to take Lacan's idea of the schizophrenic rubble of signifiers, the snapping of the signifying chain in schizophrenic speech. Essentially, schizophrenics speak nonsense. Psychotics talk nonsense. Interesting to know what psychotics, people who have had psychotic breaks, would say to that. You might feel that they were making sense, just you couldn't understand them. But leaving aside the patient voice, we still have this idea, a habit of thought, of the great lineage of master thinkers and the occlusion, the bracketing of other developments or schools as an essential, and also an unwillingness to sort of pay attention to the contingencies in the spread of psychoanalytic ideas. You might almost call it crudely an Hegelian vision of the development of psychoanalytic thought. The real irrational, and history displays the working out of an inevitable logic culminating in whoever is de rigueur in the latest bit of critical theory. But rather than proceed with that habit of thought, we can think instead about the adventitious factors, the supposedly inessential elements in the translation and the transplantation of psychoanalysis that reveals them. What I think you might call a fruitful multiplicity of psychoanalytic theories, none of which I think can be easily or simply dismissed, nor taken on trust. They can be encountered and evaluated. They all, in many ways, have something to say. And the historian John Berman has emphasised this point and the importance of the historical change, he says, that takes place when someone reads and learns a new set of ideas and then integrates those ideas with something that they already hold from the rest of their culture. Psychoanalysis comes to you and you adapt it, whatever form it's given to you, to the cultural presuppositions that you bring to it, your starting point. It's always slightly modified and changed. And part of that cultural difference, one that's interested me, it's not the only one, can be national culture as well. Paul Rosen's made this point that every country, he says, has received Freud's teachings in accord with its own national needs and traditions of thought. And that's one form of adventitious formation of psychoanalytic critical theory. I don't think it's taught about in the bumper books of theory that we encounter. Rosen says, when I first started out working on Freud in the early 1960s, I was fascinated with the comparison and contrast in how he had been accepted in Great Britain and the United States. I found there were differences both within medicine and general popular culture, and after I'd spent only one academic year studying in England, telling use of language there, it was apparent to me that there was a gulf between psychoanalysis there and in America. And the more I've learned since about different national communities and the way Freud's ideas get taught around the world, the easier it becomes to spot some of the striking aspects to each country's response to psychoanalysis. So what I'm going to do for the remainder of the concluding third of the lecture is just discuss in a brief way, in a kind of brief opposite way, some of that cultural territorial contingency in the development of psychoanalytic ideas. I'm just going to take three theories: Lacanian, Jungian, and what I'll call object relations theory, which was crucially developed by people in this institution, in Glasgow University. And the question will be very simple for each slide. It'll just be, what is the nature of the unconscious in this theory? And what does it tell us about the needs to which the psychoanalysis was adapted, the local needs and traditions? Because like it or not, we're all in some way woven up in the particular needs of our culture. They're there for us. I will do some exposition of Lacan. Let's turn to the Lacanian unconscious, a concept that flourishes in a French francophone context. And you can think about Lacan's work in one useful way. You can think about it as a response to the problem, the conceptual problem of the unconscious mind, and how we might know the unconscious mind and what its nature could be. That phrase, unconscious mental activity, seems paradoxical. I mean, isn't the mark, isn't being conscious the mark of the mental? How can you have unconscious mentation? Isn't a contradiction in terms? Moreover, you might say, well, how can we even employ the idea of an unconscious mind when it's essentially unobservable? I mean, the behaviourists were suspicious enough of introspection, of conscious experience. It must be so much worse when it's in some way mental activity that isn't even conscious. How can you have that in any kind of theory of knowledge? How can you possibly know something that's utterly unobservable, by definition unobservable? Well, the Lacanian solution, in its way, is oddly like behaviorism. It says, well, the unconscious mind isn't ontologically subjective. It isn't inner experience. It isn't even inner experience pushed down and repressed. The unconscious mind is instead intersubjective. The unconscious is not hidden away in the basement of somebody else's mind, but instead it's publicly observable in the linguistic interaction between analyst and patient, and in the linguistic acts, interpretations and constructions in that, well, hard to call it a dialogue, a conversation of some kind. There's a way of thinking about psychoanalysis in a very public, linguistic, observable way. Psychoanalysis looks for ambiguity, slips of the tongue, multiple meanings. And you can see this happening. The putatively loving husband in analysis intends to say, I adore my wife. Slip of the tongue says, I abhor my wife. Psychoanalyst picks up on this. This is no mere accident. And seeks out more evidence, invites further disclosures. What about the time he forgot to buy her a present? Did he call her by another name at some point? Did he dream she was dead? And so the evidence accumulates in a public observable linguistic encounter. You don't need to worry about unconscious minds that are not conscious, because this stuff is out there in the intersubjective world. And so the unconscious is not really an entity as such. You can talk about the unconscious, but that's a kind of reifying way of speaking about this process of endless challenge of the patient's sense of mastery over their own words. Mastery that is, of course, a narcissistic delusion born of the liver stage. And that introduces what you might broadly call, okay, admittedly, a phallogocentric interpretation, but nonetheless one that is broadly deconstructive. It's looking for marginal ambiguities that challenge the intended whole, but within this particular analytic framework. Now that approach to the unconscious mind is probably hegemonic within literary and cultural theory, but it's far from a rational necessity of development. There's no great Hegelian story, I think, that has to issue in that as the only rational solution to the problems of psychoanalytic theory. If you've read Lacanian theory, you'll notice this railing against the awful American ego psychology, or ego psychoanalysis, which supposedly is taking everything that's exciting about Freud and then taming it and adapting it to post-war functionalist sociology. Psychoanalysis becomes a means of reconciling you to your social role. That is its function. It's ultimately an accommodationist technology. Denounced. This is denounced. But as much as ego psychology is American, so Lacanian theory is French. It's there. It reflects the contingencies of its context. You can infer that philosophical customs point at work. Certain elements are imported in and then adapted to national circumstances. Lacanian theory meets very well the needs of other parts of French intellectual culture. And we know these kind of parts. Hegel, hermeneutics, structural linguistics. It's adapted to that context by these factors. It's not the only path of development. Of course, the conclusion is it may not be the only path for us to follow. Here's another way of adapting the unconscious. Jungian psychoanalysis, yet more contingencies. Jung, great colleague and then, if you like, with Freud, he was often sympathetic to Freudian psychoanalysis, but he soon departed from it. And he started positing this distinct idea of a collective unconscious. Now Jung says, okay, there is a personal unconscious, and I think he thinks of it in the traditional way. It's unconscious mentation, that Lacanian thing. There's a personal unconscious. It does develop during the course of your life because of repression or dissociation. And it does contain repressed emotions, complexes of painful thought and feeling, stuff that's traumatic. What says Jung? Well, that's a personal unconscious, but there's also a collective unconscious mind, and that, in fact, is innate. And it, moreover, it is universal, at least within your species. You won't ask about cats and dogs. But it has never been conscious. And what's in it are archetypes. And archetypes are forms that mould experience. Jung says this. The collective unconscious is inherited, and it consists of pre-existent forms, the archetypes, which can only become conscious secondarily, to infer them, and which give definite form to certain psychic contents. And what the collective unconscious is really a kind of Kantian transcendental a priori for the cultural world. They are innate, inborn, and universally present formal evidence that give form to experience like concepts to intuitions. They're forms without content. Space comes along, the forms are moulding the content. And Jung says when a situation occurs in life which corresponds to a given archetype, the archetype becomes active and it compulsively molds our experience like an instinctual drive against reason or will. If you try and stop that happening, you're going to have neurosis. So there's a new kind of it, that compulsive shaping of what I experience by the supposedly innate and universal unconscious, which is essentially a set of Kantian schema for the cultural world. Now, Jung says quite what archetypal forms there are, you have to find out observationally. He says in his writings that he was struck. He had this idea originally because he was working with a psychotic patient, and the psychotic patient was spontaneously producing material that corresponded with ancient myths that he also knew. But anyway, you need to look at what's out there in the world. You need to look at individuals and cultures. You need to look at delusions and stuff of hypnosis, childhood and adult dreams, literature, folk tales, mythology. You will find these universal schemas. For instance, you will find the shadow, the archetypal form for our benign self, the things we disavow and project onto others. And indeed, you can see a continuity from that archetype of the shadow to post-colonial theory in somebody like Fanon. Our fantasies of blackness, our racial fantasies of blackness, are essentially of the shadow self, point Fanon makes. He picks it up from Jung. He doesn't quite admit it, and he puts it into that context. Our fantasies of racial blackness are really projections of everything we want to deny about ourselves. That's the mythology of it. But of course, Jung has we've got to blame him for something, many things, but we can certainly blame him for the archetypal criticism promoted by Northrop Frye in his Anatomy of Criticism, and before that, Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. He's implicated in there somehow, and we can blame all those dreadful Hollywood films on him as well. But still the point remains, love him or loathe him, there's psychoanalysis, a theory of knowledge being adapted to the needs of a wider culture. And you can see something of those cultural coordinates. The cultural context is German-speaking, the philosophy is, broadly speaking, neo-Kantian, and the result expresses Jung's own fascination with things that are going on in his late 19th, early 20th century cultural context, like spiritualism and mediumship. That gives him material for his theory. There's what's there that's contingent. And our final exhibit, Ian D. Suttie, nobody said of. Somebody says yes, I'll be amazed. Okay, this is something that reflects specifically my own research. But psychoanalysis, when it came into Scotland, was adapted to local needs. Let's start again with an adaptation that brings to light some of the issues in evaluation of psychoanalytic theory. Let us remember that Freud was a Lamarckian. That is to say, he accepted that there was evolution. Species developed and changed. But he believed not in Darwinian evolution, but in Lamarckian evolution, in the direct hereditability of acquired characteristics. So crudely, the blacksmith is in there pounding away with his hammer on metal on the anvil all day long. It's powerful arms. His son will inherit those powerful arms. Environmentally acquired characteristics are directly transmissible. Lamarckian evolution. Then experimentally disproven by doing terrible things to mice. But anyway. Freud was a Lamarckian, although he was probably more interested in what he thought of as the inheritance of particular patterns of social behaviour. That was interesting. Give a little bit of help there in explaining the constancy of certain patterns of behaviour. But Freud was certainly not a Darwinian evolutionist, and he was indifferent to theories of natural and sexual selection that I think we all basically broadly accept. There's an element of evaluation. But when psychoanalysis arrived in the UK and in Scotland, it entered a very different intellectual context, one of which Darwinian ideas really had been in the ascendancy for many decades and increasingly accepted. And so Freudian ideas encountered people like Ian Suttie, grew up, I think, in the Western Isles, but then did his MD at Glasgow, and then did psychoanalytic training at the Tavistock Clinic in London. The Tavistock Clinic was headed by essentially another Scot in exile called Hugh Crichton Miller, and Hugh Crichton Miller had very particular ideas on on Christianity and its role in society. Sutti's major work before his premature death in 1935 was his book, The Origins of Love and Hate, which presented a very different account of psychological development to Freud and a very different account of the unconscious. Similar in some ways, but very different in what was supposedly repressed or dissociated. Now, that book, The Origins of Love and Hate, is well known in the therapeutic world, but only marginally in the world of cultural theory. Unlike Freud, Sutti argued that humans had evolved to be innately social. So there was no need for complicated explanations of how we acquire social relationships involving edible complexes and repression and identifications and aim-displaced sexuality and all the rest of it. We were actually born innately relating to other people, seeking relationship and capable of love. And he used that word very deliberately and provocatively, because he thought we found it hard to talk about love as an emotion because it wasn't tough and scientific enough. Sutti says the child is born with an attachment to mother, it is, I'm afraid, heavily gendered. Attachment to mother who is the sole source of food and protection. And his point of view there was more, I think, evolutionary than necessarily sexist. His wife was an intellectual collaborator and they worked together on papers. Attachment to a carer might be a better word, but nonetheless born with attachment. And this theory is actually a precursor of attachment theory, which became very voguish in the 90s and noughties. And Sutti says, well, the unconscious mind, there is one, he says, but it's not full of repressed sexuality. And he says, well, in fact, how could we even think that we were repressing sexuality, given that all we do is talk about it all the time, particularly in the early 20th century? No one shut up about it. In this way, it's a bit like Foucault. You've got endless proliferating discourses of sexuality. It's omnipresent. We're not really that terrified by it. We love it. What aren't we talking about? What really is repressed? So somebody came up with this very trenchant position. What was repressed was not sex, but broadly what he called tenderness. Non-sexual feelings of companionship or love are repressed, particularly amongst men because of a kind of cultural masculinity. Most repressed are both those emotions, if you like, in a kind of phenomenological sense, and also behaviours that express these feelings, certain kinds of touch. Touch is highly prohibited. They're allowed in certain contexts. And indeed, Sutti said, we're so obsessed with sex because in it we are permitted tenderness. You're allowed to touch somebody if you're having sex with them, typically. Sex is an avenue or outlet for tabooed tender feeling. And I use that phrase, the taboo and tenderness. And we have others as well in our culture. Companion animals. The man will pretend he's in a practical, collegial relationship with his pet dog. Not that he enjoys petting it, but of course he does. That pretense of practical mutual self-interest is actually an avenue for repressed tender feeling. It also says, Sutti, repressed tenderness has a cultural impact as well. It becomes, you might even say, perverted or distorted. It certainly becomes commodified as sentimental culture. Sentimentality and culture, and his reference points were Victorian sentimentality, which is dripping, is a kind of pornography of tenderness. So Sutti thinks of, terrible music hall songs about, mothers dying in empty cradles and birds flying out their nests. But of course, that still has cultural relevance. I mean, there is still quite a prominent strand of cultural materials that delight in provoking sentiment in you. Tear-jerking movies, Bambi, terrible mechanical productions like Love Story, or any other film where you get two people to fall in love and then you kill one of them. Come on, blood for me. Schmaltziness. Even in visual art. I was going to use a slide, but I didn't, because I thought, firstly, it's copyright, and secondly, you've suffered enough. Have you ever seen Thomas Kincaid? Have you ever seen this guy in shopping malls? No, you see, it's so horrific you can't look at it. Thomas Kincaid, the self-styled painter of light. You might have seen it. It's sort of a very kitschy kind of art. I think they are hand-painted but mass-produced. And typically it's things like wintry villages next to babbling brooks, Or the one I was going to show was, I think it was called something like Bambi's First Year. Rainbows in the background, and Bambi and Thumper, and it's cloyingly sentimental. But somebody's buying it. It used to be the Ocean Terminal shopping mall, I think in Edinburgh, actually had, a little boutique of Kincaid's paintings. That is commodified tenderness, that is sentimentality, that is, pornography of tender feeling. Oh, it's so cute. Now, cute is another category, I think, where you might think of Sati. Cuteness. This obsession with the cute. Where does this word come from? Why are we so obsessed with cute things? So, there's Sati, in a Scottish context, adapting psychoanalytic ideas to certain traditions he's inherited. He's a Freudian, of course, because Freud is just not Freudian, he's a Darwinian, because Darwin is just so much more accepted in the UK context. And moreover, there is certainly some kind of continuity of Christian ideas here. There's an earlier strand of evolutionary theory that argues that motherly love is some kind of providential evolution of a certain kind of virtue. And although Surrey is not theistic as such, he is somehow within that kind of programme of research. So again, contingencies, adapting ideas that can be evaluated, because I think we would rather have a Darwinian psychoanalysis if we're going to have one at all, but also showing interesting, illuminating differences as well. Well, can we think about tenderness as being repressed? Can we think of it as really the stuff that is repressed rather than sex, which is just everywhere, manifested? Anyway, to wrap up, that I hope illustrates something of the aim of this lecture, to encourage an approach to psychoanalytic theory that's more aware of the diverse research traditions that have sprung up in different times and places. I think we have a bit too much of a tendency to a psychoanalytic theoretical monoculture. Certain approaches dominate, they're very recondite, and you invest a lot of time making sense of them. And a certain rhetoric is privileged, one that encourages that element of submission to the master thinker. I must, at all costs, make sense of this. And I'll worry about later whether it could be right or wrong or plausible or implausible or if there are alternatives. Moreover, I think we have to think of that dominant hegemonic lineage as parochial in its own way. There is something parochial about Lacan. He is a product of a certain kind of cultural demand and translation and transformation. And no doubt there's something we need to reflect on about his adoption into an Anglophone context as well. From the 70s onwards, making him very voguish, but not undisputed. I suppose my hope is that this lecture will just slightly unsettle your preconceptions about what counts as good or useful psychoanalytic cultural theory. I'm asking you all to become dyed-in-the-wool Ian Suttyites, but you might encounter other neglected strands of psychoanalytic thought. You might think, well, I never heard of that analyst. Is there something interesting you could say about cultural materials? Or they say something about cultural materials already. What is it? Why don't I know it? And can I assess and evaluate it in contrast to the stuff that I am using? Whatever you do, I think, try to escape that, to use Billig's phrase, that subservient position of needing to accept the authoritative word of the master. Feel free to encounter different ideas and to evaluate as well as you interpret, as well as you use these theories. Which point? Not time for the master to shut up. Any other questions?
Thank you very much.